Good evening. My name is James Skidmore, and I'm the director of the Waterloo Centre for German Studies, a research institute at the University of Waterloo, here in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Ich möchte Sie herzlich willkommen heißen zu unserem Grimm Lecture 2020. I'd like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you from the campus of the University of Waterloo, which is on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the strange circumstances we find ourselves in today. It's a difficult time with the coronavirus pandemic. It has disrupted life throughout the world. Here in Ontario, a state of emergency has been declared. Many institutions and businesses and houses of worship have closed. Large gatherings are forbidden. Borders are shutting down. Travelers are stuck in faraway places. Most importantly, people are sick and dying. We're all affected by anxiety and uncertainty. So why are we holding this lecture under these circumstances? Well, we had 350 people sign up for this lecture that we were going to hold at the Balsillie School of International Affairs here in Waterloo. And we thought if we could find a safe way to hold the lecture, we should try to do so. If for no other reason than to show that even in difficult times, it does us good to continue engaging with topics that make us think about the world that we live in. Plus, with everybody at home or staying indoors, we have a captive audience. So we reached out to Sherwood Systems, an event production firm here in Kitchener-Waterloo, to help us stream this lecture live to Facebook and YouTube. And at the same time, we're recording the lecture so we can put it on our website for later viewing. Before I introduce our speaker, Samantha Rose Hill, I'd like to thank everyone who has helped make this possible. The Departments of Germanic and Slavic Studies and the Department of Philosophy have co-sponsored the event. The Arts Computing Office and Information Systems Office here at the University of Waterloo, Bill Baer, Todd Marshall-Taylor, Gwendolyn Nubila, Neville Bromley, Kasper Koziol, and Scott Patterson helped with some of the technical issues. I'd also like to thank the Copenhagen-based artist Peter Burke for letting us use his portrait of Hannah Arendt for the eye-catching event poster designed by Kitchener-Waterloo graphic designer extraordinaire Betty Winge. Here with me at the WCGS office on the campus of the university is Davian Hart from Sherwood Systems, who is managing the live streaming for us. And we're grateful that he's been able to do this for us on short notice. Also with me is my colleague, Misty Matthews-Roper. Misty has put in countless hours in organizing this event, and she has been a rock these past few days as we scramble to bring together this live stream event for you. And please don't worry, we're maintaining social distance practices of 2 meters or 6 feet apart from each other. So now to the lecture. When I did a rough draft of this introduction a couple of weeks ago, I started with the following sentence: "We live in unsettling times." Today that sounds like an understatement. But if you can think back to before the pandemic, to what Stephen Colbert calls the before times, you'll remember that the past few years have indeed been unsettling. We've been made more acutely aware of the climate crisis. We've wondered about the ability of democratic institutions to withstand extremism. We've continued to grapple with terrorism and struggle with migration. When Katie Fulfer of Waterloo's Gender and Social Justice program let me know that she would be teaching a seminar on Hannah Arendt this term, it occurred to me that Arendt would be a good topic for our annual Grimm lecture. For the past few years, there's been a resurgence of interest in the writings of this Jewish German-American political theorist. This became especially apparent with the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and the general anxiety surrounding the rise of populism in Europe, North America, and elsewhere. With Katie's help, and I'm really grateful to Katie for all she did to help bring this together, I reached out to Samantha Rose Hill, Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Humanities and Politics at Bard College, and asked if she would come to Waterloo to help explain why Arendt is so important for today's political culture. Dr. Hill is eminently qualified to speak to us today. She has a deep and extensive knowledge not only of Arendt's thoughts and writings, but also of her life. Dr. Hill's biography of Arendt will be appearing within the next year. She's also translated her poetry into English, which surprised me because I didn't even know that Arendt had written poetry. Her Twitter feed is a wonderful resource of quotations and little bits of trivia about Hannah Arendt, and I encourage you to look it up when you get a chance. And while most of us may be familiar with Arendt's most famous dictum, the banality of evil, which she coined when she was covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust, there's much more to discover about this complex thinker who challenges us at every turn to re-examine our ideas and our beliefs. I'll stop here. Better that you hear from Dr. Hill herself. Please note that during the lecture, you have the opportunity to post questions on either the Facebook or YouTube live streams, or you can email questions to us at wcgs@uwaterloo.ca. We'll monitor those and select a couple of questions to put to Dr. Hill after her lecture. So please join me from wherever you are in welcoming Dr. Samantha Rose Hill, who is joining us from her home in New York. Samantha.
Thank you, Skid. Thank you for that wonderful and timely introduction. I want to thank a couple of other people before I get started. Thank you, Katie Fulfer, for helping to organize this event. I really wish I would have been able to visit your Hannah Arendt class this term. Thank you, Misty, for all of your organizational work, and Davian for the technical work on this live stream, all of the departments that are co-sponsoring, and the Waterloo Center for German Studies for the invitation. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you there in person tonight. Instead, as Skid just said, I'm here in my home in Germantown, New York. I am sitting in my kitchen where I have the best access to reliable internet. And I have not at this point left my house in 6 days. These are what we might call dark times. But I am very happy to be here with everyone who is watching this via live stream, and happy that we were able to make this talk happen. And hopefully, instead of dwelling in the current crisis being caused by the pandemic, this will also offer us a collective moment to stop and think a little bit about Hannah Arendt's life and work. So often when I'm offering an introductory lecture on Hannah Arendt, I begin by saying that in a certain way, Arendt's work is about two questions that are fundamentally interconnected with one another. The first question is, how can we protect spaces of freedom which require movement in the world? And the second is a question she writes in one of her thinking journals. Gibt es ein Denken, das nicht tyrannisches ist? Is there a way of thinking that is not tyrannical? Is there a way of thinking that is not tyrannical? And tonight I'm going to focus primarily on the second question, with the conscious awareness that the first question is probably on many people's minds. So as Skid said, in recent years, in moments of political crisis, many people have reached for the work of Hannah Arendt to try to begin to understand what is happening in our world now. And her work is not a roadmap into the future or a guide to divine our current situation, but it is something that we can hold on to in thinking that can help us undertake the work of understanding. And Arendt's work offers us a way of thinking that orients us toward the present moment we live in. And she teaches us, above all, how to engage in self-reflective critical thinking. This is in part what makes her work feel timeless. She's thinking about the fundamental questions of the human condition while always responding to the moment that she's living in. And our moment today is not her moment. which is why she warns against relying upon historical analogy or falling prey to radical hope and despair. She discourages us from relying on any form of prefabricated framework or systematic form of thinking that might delimit our ability to come face to face with the world as it is, with all of its beauty and horror. And she says the most difficult thing then is to love the world with all of the eviling and suffering in it. So what she does is she turns us toward the process of thinking itself. What is it that we're doing when we engage in the process of thinking? From her school days studying thinking with Martin Heidegger at the University of Marburg to her final work, The Life of the Mind, the activity of thinking is central to her life and work. At the beginning of the human condition, she says, "What I propose, therefore, is very simple. It is nothing more than to think what we are doing." When she covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem for the New Yorker magazine, she found that Eichmann lacked the capacity to engage in self-reflective critical thinking, to imagine the world from the perspective of another. And her final work, The Life of the Mind, begins with a treatise on thinking and asks where we are when we think. So, what is this thinking? I'm going to walk through some of the key elements of Arendt's understanding of thinking and then return us to our present moment. So for Arendt, first and foremost, all thinking moves from experience. In a 1972 panel discussion organized by the Toronto Society for the Study of Social and Political Thought, she responds to a question about the work of political theory, saying, "What is the subject of our thought? Experience, nothing else." Arendt had been invited to attend the conference as a guest of honor, and she insisted on participating instead. Arendt intentionally turned away from professional philosophy after the burning of the Reichstag on February 27th, 1933. She had finished her dissertation on love in St. Augustine with Karl Jaspers at the University of Heidelberg, and was working on her Habilitation, her second book project, Rachel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewish Woman, which was to be a critique of German Romanticism. And in many ways, Arendt became a writer by accident. In order to engage in the work of understanding, she had to write. It was a necessary condition of understanding wrought from the circumstances of the century that she was born into. And she was struck by how philosophical forms of thinking, the forms of thinking that she had been schooled in and grown up with, had allowed for some of Europe's intellectual elite to look away from the rise of National Socialism. And she remained skeptical of the so-called professional thinkers and intellectuals after the war. When she saw what was happening in Germany, she decided that she could not be a bystander. She described the Reichstag Fire as an immediate shock. For her, it was clear that the world of professional thinkers and philosophers were failing to see what was happening before them. So the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism that emerged in the middle of the 20th century for Arendt broke the tradition of Western political thought. And for her, this meant that the old concepts and categories, those things that we hold on to in thinking and trying to understand the world, could no longer be counted upon, that we had to find new concepts and categories to come face to face with the present of our political reality. And so Arendt describes thinking in this break, in this gap space, as denken ohne Geländer, or thinking without a banister. In an interview, she says, "I have this metaphor, which I've never published, I've always kept for myself. I call it thinking without a banister. That is, you go up and down the stairs, and you can always hold on to the banister so you don't fall down." But she says, we've lost this banister, right? And so we reach for something to hold on to in thinking. We need to find a way in. And Arendt's metaphor here suggests that what we would wish to hold on to has been lost, that the concepts and categories that allow us to make judgments are no longer relevant to the contemporary political crises that we face. And so in the wake of loss, what is it that we hold on to? So part of Arendt's point here is that the appearance of totalitarianism upended the common sense categories of good and bad, that good and bad as moral standards of judgment could no longer be counted upon in order to provide guidance for how to think, judge, and act in the world. The law could not be looked to for guidance because the law sanctioned murder. And so Arendt turns us toward that concept of personal responsibility and the concept of judgment, which mediates between thinking and acting. We abstain from murder, she says, for example, not because the law says to, not because the law says thou shalt not murder, but because committing the act of murder would throw us out of harmony with ourselves and force us to live with a murderer. This is particularly harmful to our capacity to think, because thinking, as Arendt understands it, is a dialogue we conduct with ourselves. It's a dialogue we have with ourselves. And one who commits a murder is condemned to live with a murderer and to converse continually with someone who is morally compromised. And this, Arendt suggests, is so dissonant that it degrades, it breaks down our capacity to think. This also means that our experiences do not always line up with what we're told is right. And our experiences also do not always line up with philosophical concepts of truth, for example, either. We must think for ourselves and with ourselves, for Arendt. And Arendt is always turning us back toward the world of experience in thinking, which means that we can't rely upon any kind of Procrustean frame for understanding, because the world of experience is always changing. And as we're experiencing right now, it can change rather quickly. So for Arendt, this also means that there's no end in thinking. We must continuously wander up and down the staircase without a banister. Or to put it another way, in a lecture she gave on the history of political theory in 1956, she says that concepts are never the end of the thinking process, but always well springs from which we begin to do the work of thinking. Historically, the work of political thinkers has been the work of concepts. For Plato, truth; for Machiavelli, revolution; for Hobbes, power, she says. And for Arendt, the work of political thinking is conceptual. She is a conceptual thinker, but she is always undoing concepts, engaging in the work of dismantling. She's not writing systematic philosophy to get to a concept. And this is important for Arendt because the concepts and categories that we hold on to in our thinking must reflect our lived experience and present historical moment. And this is also why her divisions are not hard and fast distinctions or crystallized. They're material and porous. They're always moving from lived experience. For Arendt, the work of thinking is the work of understanding. It's an ongoing process. The desire to understand outweighs the desire to know, to engage in the production of knowledge. Understanding, or verstehen in German, contains the sense of steh, which is to stand. And when one engages in the work of understanding, one must come to a standstill. This understanding, this verstehen, is central to Arendt's understanding of thinking and judgment, which leads to the second element. We must stop and think what we are doing. So she says there's this English idiom, stop and think. Nobody can think unless he stops. So thinking moves from experience, and we must stop and think about what it is that we're doing and reflect upon our actions in order to develop a sense of self-responsibility. Arendt's conception of thinking requires both this stopping and reflecting. And I want to give you two examples that she draws on to illustrate each of these points. The first is Socrates, and the second is Proust. So the idiom stop and think is exemplified by Plato's Socrates, who for Arendt embodies the thinker par excellence. And the activity of thinking is depicted by the similes applied to Socrates in Plato's dialogues. Socrates is said to be like the stingray that paralyzes his interlocutors, forcing them to stop, to stand still. Like a gadfly, he irritates them, goading them, arousing them to think. And like a midwife that draws forth wind eggs or empty ideas, so that his interlocutors are forced to recognize their ignorance and are prompted to begin the work of thinking again. Before we can be prompted to think, we must be forced to stop. Stopping is an interruption, a slowing down, a coming to a halt. It requires a different temporality beyond our day-to-day routine of just doing, beyond moving from one activity to the next. It interrupts the impulse to jump to action without contemplation. It disrupts the impulse to the question, but what can I do? And it opens up a space. It's an invitation for contemplation. We might think about this political moment we're facing globally right now as a slowing down, as a stopping, as an invitation to be still for a while and to engage in this act of contemplation. When we do stop and think, the subject of our thinking is our experience. It's our experience, how we experience the world. And thinking itself is an experience that we have. So the other side of this is reflecting. And in the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt turns to Marcel Proust and remembrance of things past to emphasize the importance of reflecting that occurs in the activity of thinking, describing how thinking as a dialogic activity, as a dialogue, unfolds as a form of inner experience. She says the individual and his reconsiderations belong to society. Even when he retires into the mute and uncommunicative solitude in which Proust himself finally disappeared when he had decided to write his work, there his inner life, which insisted on transforming all worldly happenings into inner experience, became like a mirror in whose reflection truth might appear. So in this passage, one can see how experience in the world becomes inner experience in private life, where one is presented with a mirror image in the mind to contemplate and able to look upon their experiences in the world with some distance. This distance in contemplating experience and contemplating the experience of others is necessary for the faculty of judgment. And this leads to the third element, the need for solitude. For Arendt, the private realm is necessary for solitude. In the origins of totalitarianism, she says, all thinking is done in solitude, and the private realm is necessary for that space of thinking. It's where we go when we go to think. It's difficult not to be struck by the irony of that as I sit alone in front of my computer in my kitchen, as perhaps many of you listening to this might be sitting alone. So the private realm is where we go to get away from the glaring light of public life. It's the space of the four walls, as Arendt calls them. It's where we're able to retreat from the world of appearances and take refuge in private. I often think of it as that moment of exhalation when you step inside after a long day and can be alone with yourself. So solitude is necessary for that two-in-one conversation. And it's only possible when we can be alone without being lonely, and when we can exist freely away from the eyes and the ears of others. And just as much as this understanding of thinking requires that we safeguard the private realm, it also requires that we know how to be alone with ourselves without being lonely, how to tell stories to ourselves about our experiences in the world and to make meaning from them through thinking and storytelling, how to keep ourselves company. This point feels all the more relevant at this moment where many people are concerned about the loneliness epidemic that many individuals have been dealing with for the past several years, in part in response to the rise of social media and the way that that has changed our relationship to ourselves and others. And it feels all the more pertinent right now where we are being forced into a state of isolation. At the end of the origins of totalitarianism, to emphasize the point, Origins is a nearly 600-page book. It's actually 3 books in one, on anti-Semitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism. And in the work, Arendt constellates the various elements that crystallized in the emergence of fascism and totalitarianism, the collapse between fact and fiction, the breakdown of the rule of law, the privatization of public political institutions, the decline of the nation state, and importantly, the rise of mass homelessness and rootlessness, which leads to a loss of meaning. And then she gets to the last 10 pages, and she argues that the underlying common ground for all terror is loneliness. So why loneliness? Because totalitarian domination bases itself on loneliness, on the experience of not belonging to the world at all, she says. And this experience, Arendt writes, is one of the most radical and desperate experiences that we can have as a human being. So when we're lonely, we're cut off from others. And when we're cut off from others, we have no way of trusting our own sense, our own sensual experiences of the world, which rely upon our common sense. So loneliness compromises our ability to think. And she says only because we have common sense, that is, because not one man, but men in the plural inhabit the earth, can we trust our immediate sensual experience. And this means that we also must be able to move freely between the different realms of life, between the private realm, the social realm, and the public realm. When all of life is politicized or subject to the light of the public realm, we lose this ability to move, to return to the private sphere, and to find a space of solitude to think. When we're alone with ourselves in this space of solitude, we're able to think together with ourselves. So what is this conversation that I am having with myself? Arendt describes thinking as a 2-in-1 conversation. And this 2-in-1 conversation requires the private realm, it requires solitude, it requires self-harmony, and an ability to imagine the world from the perspective of another. It also requires a sense of fidelity to oneself. So we have the image of Socrates, we have the image of Proust, we might add the image of Machiavelli and the 7th letter to that, where he describes returning home at the end of the day, retiring to his study, stripping naked, putting on his robes, and entering the court of the ancients. Arendt was fond of repeating words attributed to Cato, that he was never less alone than when he was alone by himself. The fundamental quality of the human condition is plurality. Men and not men inhabit the earth and share the world in common. Even when we're alone, we're not really alone. And even when we are alone with ourselves and thinking, we are not solely alone with ourselves. Our thinking is conditioned by the plurality of the human condition. Arendt says this dialogue of the 2-in-1 does not lose contact with the world, because the world of fellow men is represented in the self with whom I lead the dialogue of thought. In Thinking in the Life of the Mind, in the section on 2-in-1, Arendt connects this dialogue, this concept of thinking, to the question of evil, and in particular with the interconnection between thoughtlessness, non-thinking, as she writes, and evil. And here we come to Arendt's claim that thinking might prevent evil doing in the world, and where she says the sad truth of the matter is that most evil is done by people who never make up their mind whether to do or be evil or good. She writes, if there is anything in thinking that could prevent us from doing evil, it must be some property inherent in the activity of thinking itself. The activity of thinking, the idea is, might condition us to abstain from doing evil, but it's never a guarantee. And this leads to Arendt's claim that there are no dangerous thoughts, that the activity itself, the activity of thinking itself, is dangerous. Every human being, she writes, is a thinking being and can reflect just as I do, and therefore can judge for himself if he wants to. Yet there is no definitive answer for how we might make people engage in this form of self-reflective critical thinking. Arendt suggests the only thing that can help us is to reflect, to remember, to think back. And thinking in this sense means that we must subject whatever is thought to critical examination. She argues there are no dangerous thoughts for the simple reason that thinking itself is such a dangerous enterprise to all creeds, convictions, and opinions. It's dangerous because it has the power to disrupt our sense of self, to unsettle our convictions and belief systems. This also means that we have the ability, the power to articulate meaning in our own lives, and that thinking, like breath itself, is both disruptive and constitutive of the self. It allows us to open up space, to assign new meaning, to create new constellations of meaning, to confront the concepts, the ideas that we're using in the process of thinking itself. So there's no definitive way to make people stop and think, but we can create conditions that make stopping and thinking more likely. And thinking, Arendt asks, where are we when we think? Today, we might ask, do we have space to think? One of my favorite statistics comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics annual American Time Use Survey, which says people spend about 17 minutes a day on average thinking, and another 17 minutes reading for pleasure. I have no idea how they're thinking about thinking when they ask that question, or what people might hear, but 17 minutes compared to the nearly 3 hours a day people spend watching television. Without self-reflective critical thinking, our ability to judge suffers. Our ability to discern between fact and fiction, to trust facts, to trust scientific facts, to trust common sense, suffer. And rarely do we linger in contemplation or take time to engage in the kind of thinking Arendt is talking about. Rarely today are we alone with ourselves anymore without the constant interruption of the social or the political, or the presence in some form or another of our digital devices that make us feel connected to the world, that make us feel connected at the expense of our solitude, which is my way of saying it's important today to make space for solitude, to safeguard the private realm where we can find the space necessary to engage in conversation with ourselves, despite all of the temptations to distraction that we're constantly subject to. So in moments of darkness, not unlike the one we're experiencing now, we might remind ourselves also that Hannah Arendt saw the worst her century had to offer. And the question that she came back to was, how do we love the world? And I want to end with a kind of story from Hannah Arendt's biography. For the past while, I've been submerged in writing a biography of Hannah Arendt and translating her poems. And I want to just share one anecdote which has stuck with me in thinking about Arendt and thinking about Arendt's conception of thinking. So, as some of those who knew her have recalled her to me, Hannah Arendt was not a sentimental person. She wasn't interested in the work of professional thinkers who turned away from the practical question of politics and doubled down on ideas in times of crisis. She disdained pity, shunned empathy in the public sphere, and reserved sentiment for her private correspondences. But from the beginning of Love in St. Augustine to her final work, Judging, Arendt consistently came back to the question of the beautiful in her thinking, to the idea of the beautiful in her thinking. And when she was 7 years old, her father died from syphilis. And she had watched him decline in their home and then the hospital from ataxia and paresia, which is a kind of madness. And when she was standing next to her mother at his funeral, crying, her mother asked her why she was crying. And she told her that she was crying not because she was sad, but because the singing was so beautiful. And I think it's easy to take the beautiful for granted, even more so in moments of darkness, when we feel freedom being constricted, when we feel language under attack, when we feel like we're being subjected to forces beyond our reach. But the idea that of the beautiful that Arendt returned to throughout her life parallels her understanding of thinking. In Kant's critique of judgment, he argues that judgments of the beautiful are disinterested, that we take pleasure in something because we judge it to be beautiful, not because it is inherently so. And we will our judgment of the beautiful universally because we think it's necessary, we want to share it. And judgments of the beautiful are like thinking. They're without purpose, they're without end. And that is, there's no end in thinking for Arendt. And so I want to just leave us with that thought before we transition to a question and answer period in this moment of political crisis, and hope that this slowing down, which is beyond our own immediate power, might also be an invitation to think about Arendt's conception of thinking and how we might become more engaged in thinking itself and contemplation. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Really thank you for that. That's been an extremely interesting talk, and there's been some chatter on the various channels, and so we're happy to see that. We have a few minutes for questions. If people would like to send in a question, please do so, and we'll try to get to some of them. One question I want to start with that we received was that there was a lot of discussion about the Bannister metaphor, and I'm wondering if you could.
I'm so sorry. I had it. This is a technical error.
You had it muted.
I did it again because I could hear you talking.
Okay, I'll repeat it. Not a problem.
Can we start over?
Yeah, of course. Well, yes.
I'm not very good at technology.
No, this is all good. I'll start over. So thanks for that. We got some good questions and some good comments, and some chatter. So I'll ask a couple of questions. One of them was there was some discussion in the threads about the Bannister metaphor, and I think some people would like maybe a little more elaboration or clarification on that.
Great. So Arendt offers this metaphor that she reserved for personal use in her thinking in an interview she gives. And so when we engage in the process of thinking, consciously or unconsciously, we're holding on to concepts or ideas that allow us to think about something. From the time we're very little, thought processes are embedded in the way that we think about the world. If you think about something as simple as a parent telling their child not to touch a surface because it's hot, bad, or cold, good, we learn these kinds of forms of reactive thinking. So the first thing is Arendt is trying to pull us into a space where we can be conscious of the way it is we're thinking and how we're thinking. But she's addressing a philosophical problem here. So the Bannister is a metaphor for the work of concepts and categories in the proper sense. So we use concepts like judgment in order to think about how it is we come to make a judgment of something like the beautiful. Or we use frameworks of morality that teach us what is good and what is bad to make personal judgments about how we should act in the world. So when she's talking about thinking without a Bannister here, she's talking about this break that happens in the 20th century with the emergence of totalitarianism. So in Germany, it was the law to murder, right? And so often we look to the law as a standard of judgment to tell us how we should act in the world. And what she's saying is that these standards of judgment that we've taken for granted and relied upon in making decisions about how to be can no longer be relied upon, that the banisters have been taken away, and that we're walking up and down the staircase perpetually without a banister, which means that we have to constantly, perpetually be engaging in this work of thinking anew, looking for new concepts. So let me just give you one quick example of that. in her essay on authority, which is a wonderful essay, she begins by saying, so the title of the essay is What is Authority? And she begins by saying, the question isn't what is authority, it should be what was authority. And then she walks us through the history of authority as a concept over time to think about how we've lost this concept of authority and why it was so important. And so we don't have the concept of authority to hold on to anymore, but we can engage. So we begin the work of thinking from the concept, as opposed to somebody like Kant, for example, who's writing systematic political philosophy in order to get to a proper concept of something.
When you talked about her skepticism regarding what you referred to as professional thinkers, does that connect then to this idea of the Bannister in terms of the skepticism there, or?
I think it can. So, the two examples spring to mind. One is Leo Strauss and the other is Martin Heidegger. In, I think, Elizabeth Young Ruhl's 1982 biography, she talks about how Arendt saw what was happening in Germany before many of the other intellectuals in her immediate circle did, and she was aware of what was happening politically, and she had a number of fallings out with individuals who didn't want to come face to face with what was happening. And she gives Leo Strauss as an example of somebody who wasn't quite able to see what was happening in Germany until much later. And the other, of course, is Martin Heidegger, who she had a passionate romantic relationship with, which she broke off, and they didn't talk for a very long time. But, she was also trying to understand how someone like Heidegger, who was clearly a brilliant philosopher, was able to turn away from the world so radically that he wasn't able to see what it was he was participating in. And that's one of her critiques of Heidegger's philosophy as well. And one of the reasons that she breaks with it in studying with Jaspers is she thought that certain forms of philosophical thinking turned us away from the world of experience toward the world of ideas. And she wanted to root us in reality in the sense of immediate lived experience.
So Heidegger provided her with a counterexample, if you will.
She's quite critical of Heidegger in a number of places. And yes, I think he does provide a nice counterexample and an example of a professional philosopher who was blinded toward what was happening.
Right. Another question I'd like to put to you from one of our listeners. Since Arendt was neither a communist nor a conservative nor a fascist, I, the questioner, has always assumed that she was a liberal of some very individual kind. Could you help us understand what kind of liberal she was, if she was one?
She wasn't a liberal.
Wasn't a liberal, okay. We've settled that.
That's the short answer. No, this is a really great question. And I think it's a really timely question and worth talking about. So in that 1972 panel discussion I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I think it's Vanna, or Morgan, it might be Morgenthau who asks her, so what are you? Are you a liberal? Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? What are you? And she says, I'm not any of these things, and I never have been. She says, my parents were socialists, but I'm not a socialist. And she says, I don't think this kind of question is going to get us anywhere today, meaning that the identification with a certain form of political thinking might somehow provide us with a sense of clarity. This is fundamentally counterposed to Arendt's understanding of thinking, right? She is thinking against ideology. So liberalism is an ism, right? And she says a couple paragraphs down in that response, I'm not a liberal. I never have been a liberal. And she jokes, about her writing being Englished and the editors realizing she doesn't even believe in progress. But any kind of political ideology, Marxism, liberalism, for her would have been a form of turning us away from relying upon our own political judgment, right? Which isn't to say that we might want to, we want to ascribe certain elements of these political ideologies to her thinking, but she is radically sui generis. She is not, you cannot put her into any kind of prefabricated framework. I think there are different ways to read her, though.
Do you know if she voted when she lived in the United States?
She did vote. She voted for Kennedy. Somebody asked me that the other day, I think on Twitter. It comes. I believe she did vote. I think it comes through in her correspondence where she talks about it a bit with Mary McCarthy.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Another question for you. A bit of a different tack here. The relationship between thought, as Arendt defines it, and imagination. How do you bring those two concepts together in Arendt?
So Arendt's understanding of thinking in the way that I've been talking about it as a form of self-reflective, critical thinking is deeply Kantian. And it fundamentally requires an expansive imagination. This idea that we're able to go wandering in our thinking, to imagine the world from the perspective of another. And this is a kind of exercise in thinking which requires the imagination. This is what she says Adolf Eichmann fundamentally lacked, the ability to imagine the world from the perspective of another. But I think it's important to note there that she's not talking about empathy. She's not talking about feeling the pain of another, as Rousseau might want to have it, for example. But she's talking about, I think often of Baudelaire's poem, The Crowds, which Walter Benjamin was quite fond of when he's describing the flaneur of wandering in and out of the bodies of the individuals in the crowd, looking through their eyes, right? So it's a way of expanding the imagination so that we can think about the perspective of another in our own thinking.
Okay, thank you. A couple of more questions if you still have time, because there's a couple good ones here. Good. You don't have to rush out anywhere.
I don't have to rush out.
I didn't think you did.
Although there is an owl that appears outside my window at about 8 o'clock every night. So.
Oh, good. Maybe we can make it till owl time. Someone asked they would like to hear about how the ideas, for example, of loneliness relate to the notion of worldlessness in Arendt's work.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So she talks about this primarily at the end of The Origins of Totalitarianism. And she talks about this sense of worldlessness, of being isolated, of being cut off from humanity, a sense of rootlessness and homelessness in the existential sense of being displaced, of not having community. And for Arendt, the sense of worldlessness is related to this feeling of loneliness, to the state of being lonely, of being cut off from the world. So in The Human Condition, she begins by talking about the condition of worldliness. She also talks about earth. We inhabit the earth and we make the world in common. The world is something that we make together, that we artifice together. And when we are forced to, when the world rejects us, when we are thrown into a state of worldlessness, then we have no connection with other people in the world and no way of acting. For Arendt, action is something that we do in concert with one another. And if we are worldless, if we don't have relations to others, to the world outside of us, if we're reduced to the absolute privation of self, then we're thrown into the state of isolation and loneliness where we're desperate for meaning and for connection. And importantly for Arendt, that's what makes us susceptible to ideology, to simplified narratives that try to explain why we might feel the way we feel instead of reckoning with the complex conditions of reality.
Okay, thank you. A couple of people have asked to hear a little more about Arendt's concept of danger. How do we expand on that a little bit for perhaps for the present day even?
Yeah. So the idea is that no thought in itself is dangerous, but it's the activity of thinking that's dangerous. So when we engage in this form of thinking, it's unsettling. It makes us question our beliefs. It makes us question our opinions. It makes us question what it is we hold on to that gives us a sense of self, a sense of who it is that we are, which is what allows us to navigate the world with ease. And for Arendt, that's a dangerous idea. I'm reminded in our contemporary political moment of her essay on truth and politics, where she talks about how truth and politics have never been on good terms with one another. And that, yes.
Yes.
I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
Oh,
good evening.
oh dear.
Oh, Siri has something to add.
I turned on Siri on my computer. I think somebody's listening.
Oh no, who's listening? That's the question.
So truth and politics have never been on good terms with one another. But the profession of the truth teller has always, she says, been a dangerous business. So she gives the example of Socrates, who was put to death for provoking people to think and to question the moral norms. She talks about somebody like Thoreau, who spent a night in jail for refusing to pay his poll tax to protest the war. And I think that we're experiencing this concept of dangerous thinking a little differently today. For a long time now, we've had this discussion about fake news and fact checking. I think Colbert, like 10 years ago, had a rally against for truthiness.
Yeah, truthiness. Yes.
Truthiness.
Yes.
So this has been a part of our political imagination for a while now, and I think that this conversation about what it means to tell the truth, what it means to rely upon fact, has been thrown into disarray. When Arendt talks about truth, she always modifies it. She talks about scientific truth, mathematical truth, historical truth. And she gives certain examples. So when we start to erase historical facts, then we're actually compromising our ability to judge, our ability to think, our ability to discern fact from fiction, but that also lays the groundwork for dictatorships, for fascism, and for totalitarianism, because we don't have a way to tell the difference between what is true and what is false. I'm reminded of Donald Trump's inauguration speech, where if you watch the video, it was clearly raining, and he said it was not raining. Yeah. And it doesn't really matter if people believe it was raining or it's not raining. That's the place where we've come to today, because his claim that it's not raining is doing other political work in public discourse. People hear that as an affirmation of his willingness to reject truth. So the moral value of truth, I think, has been in sharp decline for some time now. And we see this danger of truth-telling manifest in our contemporary conversations around climate change, and even now around the outbreak of the global pandemic. It's been a rather jarring experience the past couple of weeks to watch a number of individuals that I respect highly refuse to come face to face with the reality of what's happening, or to take a long time getting there to be able to make the judgment when we've had access to certain facts, although perhaps some have been withheld. Some people are writing about this. We don't know now. So, I think there's, Arendt places an importance on relying upon historic truth, scientific truth, mathematical truth, factual truth, in this sense, because it gives us a common ground. It gives us a common ground to think from. And if we turn away from that, it's world denying.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's well put.
It was a long answer.
But a well put answer. I'm going to finish with one final question. And it's a little bit about Heidegger, who held a pessimistic view of the trajectory of technology, the transforming of people and world into a standing reserve for capital or for power. So did Arendt ever have a view about technology in relation to thinking about politics, or was she more neutral or hopeful?
So she does. There are two places I would point anyone toward. The first would be the prologue to The Human Condition, where she talks about technology. She begins with a reflection on Sputnik and travel to outer space and the way in which technology is fundamentally changing our understanding of ourself in relationship to the earth that we inhabit and to the world. And she's quite concerned. I think she has a wonderful sentence, which I'm not going to remember fully, where she says, if we're not careful, we might become slaves to all of our technological devices, which feels rather prescient today. But she is also concerned about the loss of language, and replacing language, which is what allows us to tell stories in their multitude and to find meaning collectively together, with mathematical language as a kind of system of universal signification. And she's concerned about that. The other is an essay on space and the conquest of man, where she talks a little bit more about some of those themes. But she was highly attuned to evolving technology, and also the way media was transforming the political landscape of her time. She has a wonderful essay on the first televised presidential debate and the way that television has changed our perception of political candidates, which also feels relevant today.
Yeah. I wanted to end with that question because this has been a technological event, of course, and it's been and I'm sorry to everyone that if I can't get to all of your questions, there are just too many. But I am grateful to Davian that we've been able to make this happen as a it's not easy to live stream. If you take a look at our Twitter feed, and you'll see all the equipment that Davian needed just to make this happen. It's amazing, but it allowed us to speak to you and to gain to hear your insights and to gain from your deep knowledge of Hannah Arendt. So Samantha, I really want to thank you. It's just been wonderful. What you've done is make us stop and think. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that for two reasons. You made us stop and think about some interesting and pressing questions, but you also made us stop and not think about everything else that's been going on the past few days. And for me, that's a bit of a relief because, of course, we'll end this and then we'll go back to living in our sheltered homes and staying away from each other for a few more weeks, and it's tough on all of us. So I want to thank you for that, and I just thank you for being so agreeable to do all of this with us. We're really grateful.
Of course, and thank you so much. This has really been a surprising and pleasurable experience, and I'm thankful for the technology that we have that has allowed us to do this, and for all the work that has gone into making this event happen. I was tempted to talk more about what's happening right now, but I thought it might be nice to just dive into Arendt and thinking. So I'm happy. I'm happy about that. And thank you, Skid.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for asking questions and for following the live stream.
Yes, and to all of you who are watching, thank you very much for participating. We really appreciate it. If you're interested in, we've recorded this session and we'll put that up on our, we'll send out links and we'll have that up on our website as soon as we can. We can't say when that'll be, we're just not sure yet, but as soon as we know that it's up, we'll let you know. So thanks to all of you, thanks to Davian and Misty for helping out this evening. Without them, couldn't have done this. And thanks again to Samantha for the wonderful lecture. I'm James Skidmore from the Waterloo Center for German Studies, and I'll sign off for now, and I hope everyone stays well and stays safe. Good night.